I meet a number of people in my practice who have unexplainable panic attacks or treatment-resistant depression or an onset of an addiction or a physical medical complication that seems to have no source. And when we peel back the layers on many of those things, not all of them, but many of them, it is literally compartmentalized heavy loss.
Although we will all face grief at some point in our lives, we won't necessarily know how to process it. Through years of working with patients and dealing with her own grief, therapist Cindy Finch has developed a way to help us through loss and come out the other side stronger for the journey. She's written about this in her new book, When Grief is Good, Turning Your Greatest Loss into Your Biggest Lesson. On Author Hour today, she shares some of those specific skills, discusses what grief can teach us, and explains how one can live with honor after a loss. Hi, Author Hour listeners. I'm here today with Cindy Finch, author of When Grief is Good, Turning Your Greatest Loss into Your Biggest Lesson. Cindy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Jane. I'm super glad to be here.
I want to start just by thanking you for writing this book. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your path to becoming a therapist and a grief specialist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best thing that I could possibly say is that's the most honest is I didn't really want to write this book, and because it's about grief and it's a heavy topic, but I couldn't deny that life had sort of set me up to write it. And then I realized with the difficulties and challenges that life had presented me, that it actually kind of had me in a funnel to write this book and to also help people come through hard times. And so that's what I do now. I'm a therapist, and writing this and being able to put on the page the many different things that it takes and the lessons and support and encouragement for other people facing difficulties that are hoping it can also take them somewhere is what the book's about.
You write, and part of your argument, I suppose, is that grief can be good for us. You call grief the best guru. What does that mean?
I'm glad you asked. I can sum it up with a really little tiny quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, that failure speeds learning. And when I go through loss, failure, rejection, other tragedies, if you will, I hope it's not offensive to people, but there really is, when life puts a hard stop on us through difficulties, it forces us to look inside of ourselves and to grow, if we will. Now, a big part of my book is about grief avoidance and how we basically want to do anything other than face the reality that we find ourselves in. Like, grief on the hot pavement of real life, loss, pain, all of that stuff. Man, give me the check. Let me get out of that restaurant. I just don't want to go there. But when I do go there and I do allow myself to be changed by the process of loss, of losing, of sitting still with my difficulty, it actually grows a muscle inside of me when I face hard things. It's actually like working on your muscles in a gym, that when I allow myself to be put under the leadership of loss, if you will, it actually develops many things in me. One of them is endurance. Another one is strong character. Another thing that it develops is the possibility for resilience. The other thing it develops is a capacity to help other people who've gone through the same thing. Another one is self-confidence. When I face hard times and I have to overcome difficulties, once those things are past me, I look back and say, wow, like I can do hard things. And so if other challenges come before me, I feel more confident in myself that I can face difficulties. And that, Jane, I'm not even talking there about the byproduct of growth. I'm just talking about self-esteem at that point of, okay, like I have some capacity here as a person. I can manage hard times. And why is that important? Because life is really hard. And I meet people in my practice and they come in and, some portion of our early work together, if they haven't been through what I say is a thing or three in life, is really reorienting them to the fact that life is hard. It's supposed to be hard. We do not sign up for personal growth unless we are backed into a corner, because most of us, like on Instagram or social media, like, I just want to be happy. I want things to go well. I want to fall in love. I want to sit in bed and watch 12 hours of Netflix. Like, that stuff would make me happy. But, the flip side of happy can often be shallow. And so unless people face difficulties and grow, like, it's very difficult to develop meaning in life if I haven't had to really dig into who I am and what life is about. And it turns out that there's a lot of happiness can actually be found when I'm able to develop meaning and purpose in my life. So that's where grief, being a really good guru, grief's not going to make me happy, but it's going to lead me to some dark gifts, if you will.
All of that is on the other side of grief, if that's even possible to say, if you ever get fully through it.
It can be. It can be on the other side.
But we do have to get through it, and there's no other way. There's no up, around, or over, right?
No. And I don't want to put that out there that, hey, let's just silver lining things and let's get to the good part. So a big portion of my book is actually about how to wade through the dark rivers of grief.
What do you mean when you say the phrase grieving on purpose?
Well, so grieving on purpose is actually to set aside time with intention for grieving. What I notice as a therapist is that people will do this when they have the heavy emotions that come with grief. They want to jump out, like super uncomfortable. And by jump out, that looks like a lot of things, like especially in movies and media, you can see, people that are really uncomfortable, anxious, sad. They're at a bar, they're drinking. And the reason is because alcohol and other substances really do act as a numbing agent, because I don't want to feel it. I don't want to feel it. So the idea is actually to grieve on purpose and to sit in the feelings, to understand and process the emotions. One of the phrases I use in my book, I say that emotions are just indicators on the dashboard of our lives. And so when I have the heavier or more uncomfortable emotions, they're indicating something to me. So sadness, despair. I feel sad and I have despair because something that I really loved, something that I very much wanted to be, is no longer. So whether that's a marriage, that's a beloved, that's a child, a job, my health, any number of things, my house. When I lose things, the evidence that I valued it is that once it's gone, I feel the loss. So one of the problems is if I short circuit those feelings of loss and I just want to jump back into normal life, those feelings really don't go away. What happens is they end up just kind of hanging out below the surface, and then they can come out sideways. I meet a number of people in my practice who have unexplainable panic attacks or treatment-resistant depression or an onset of an addiction or a physical medical complication that seems to have no source. And when we peel back the layers on many of those things, not all of them, but many of them, it is literally compartmentalized heavy loss that's sitting underneath the surface for many people, that they just didn't take the time or didn't have the time or didn't know how to actually work through and feel and process and then put to rest the events that happened that brought those heavy emotions. So grieving on purpose is actually a practice of sitting with, understanding, processing, and then putting away the messages that the grief and the loss are trying to transmit to us.
And these are not skills that society and culture are teaching us.
Not typically. I mean, we're really pushed to be productive in the United States, to be efficient, to be happy, to be wealthy. When we're raising our children, we really evaluate how well they're doing. Hey, did they do the chores? Are they getting, gold stars or good grades in school? Are they making sure to follow the path of being obedient, compliant, kids, or are they looking a lot like mom and dad? Like, this is how we evaluate whether our children are doing well. But one of the things that we don't do is teach a lot of emotional intelligence to our children. And one component of emotional intelligence is self-awareness and being able to help a child sit with the heaviness or the emptiness or the anger or the anxiety that comes after the loss of a pet, the loss of a friend, the divorce of the parents, and actually call it what it is. This is grief. And we're going to take some time off of school. We may take some time off of soccer. We may push back some tests. We may not go on that trip because we're just going to let it be here because you've lost something. I mean, I can distinctly remember when I was 4 years old. Isn't that such a young age? But, I had a little friend across the street named Jeff. Jeff and I would play together. He was just directly across the street. And I would say Jeff was my best friend as much as a 4-year-old can have. But we had some wonderful play at each other's houses, and our moms would take walks together. And I just really enjoyed who he was. And then one day, he just wasn't there anymore. And I did not know that Jeff had leukemia. I did not know about anything that was going on. And of course, it's a 4-year-old. My parents weren't going to tell me all those details. That wouldn't be appropriate. But one day, Jeff just died. And I remember having this heavy feeling in my chest and like kind of this emptiness with it. And, Jane, it was just said, oh, Jeff died. What do you do with that? And 4 is really young, and maybe there's not a lot you can do except hold each other and cry. But we don't have what I call a good grief IQ in our culture. We usually want to push that stuff away. We don't want to talk about it.
This book has a lot of specific advice and tools for what to do, and I would love to get into some of them. First, I see that you work with dialectical behavioral therapy in your practice. Can you tell our listeners what that is and how that helps people process grief?
Yeah, absolutely. Dialectical behavioral therapy is a really wonderful and very specific, how can I say this best? It's a very linear therapy that is based on tracking emotions and working through a repertoire of, I think more than 75 skills that are based on mindfulness, emotion regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, and a number of other categories. But anybody who comes to DBT, which is what we call it, the short, because dialectical behavioral therapy, that's a mouthful for most people. But it was developed by a psychologist named Marsha Linehan, who she herself really struggled with severe emotion dysregulation. So regulating emotions was very hard for her. She spent a couple of years, if you can imagine, in a psych hospital. Like, who spends years in a psych hospital anymore? But she did. And then she realized that ECT, which is electric shock therapy, medications, even talk therapy weren't working for her particular condition. So she developed this strategy, if you will, for regulating emotions and self-soothing and basically self-management. And one of the big things that DBT teaches is radical acceptance. And radical acceptance, first of all, is not an end unto itself, but it's a big pause in life where things that I do not like have happened, things that I would love to change, things that I would fight against, things that are absolutely unacceptable to me still happen. And this is the essence of dialectics. Concept of dialectics is that two things that seem like polar opposites can both be true at the same time. I can love somebody and hate them. It can be sunny outside and still raining. And radical acceptance is the big skill that says I can really stand against something. I can be fighting cancer, or my loved one can be fighting cancer, and they can still die. And so radical acceptance teaches exactly what it sounds like. I must learn to radically accept very difficult things if I'm going to be able to cope in life. And the step-by-step skill is pretty powerful. And a big part of this DBT skill is actually grieving with intention for the loss of the things I cannot change.
So, how do we grieve with intention? Can you talk about some of the skills you recommend in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. There's several in there that are based in each chapter, but one of the things that which seems so simple, but it's sneaky in that it's pretty powerful, is just a checklist. I call it the grief response checklist, where you just look and see, okay, these are the actual symptoms of grief. And I have about, I don't know, maybe 100, which is probably too many for a book. And I've got them on my website. But just to know that body aches, not being clear headed, can't remember things, stomach aches, wanting to avoid life, even being really short fused. I remember I have a client, and it was just so true for this right here. She had lost her daughter to an overdose, just a terrible situation. Her daughter was so young. And a couple days after her daughter passed away, her husband and her took the dog out because the dog, was just going crazy in the house. They were so busy. They took the dog out for a walk, and the dog, did what dogs do and just squatted to pee-pee on the neighbor's lawn as they were walking by. And the neighbor shot at them like, "What are you doing? Get that dog off my lawn." And she turned and looked at their neighbor and blasted him. "My daughter just died." It's basically like that, because that's so true with grief. If somebody leaves me, if I lose somebody, if I'm in a car accident, any number of things, there's so much anger and frustration and rage that goes with that. So the grief response checklist is a place where people can look and see, am I normal? Okay, if it's on here, then this must be part of my grief. So I call the grief response checklist just a way to locate yourself. And that's one of the tools that I start with. And the next one is called the story. And this is where I begin to write just little tiny phrases. Here's my name and here's what happened. And then I even put in little, what I call process prompts. Like one of them is, if I had a time machine, I would, dot, dot, dot. And this is just a way for people to begin to access some of the things that are sitting under the storyline for them. And it's so essential because a lot of times when we go through a loss, like let's say my partner divorces me and that's not what I wanted, one of those things that, if I had a time machine, I would dot, 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 is I would go back and spend time. I would have that conversation. I would follow my gut. I would have went to counseling. But it gives a way for the person to put it out on the page. It doesn't mean anything more than that, but a lot of times the stuff is rattling around in us anyway. So if I have a place to just get it out, then that's a good thing. And then there's, I don't know, 5 or 8 or 10 more skills after that.
One I really connected with is some guidance around a cry closet.
Oh, the cry closet. I came up with this idea because at one point we left a house where we had lived for a number of years, and we were cleaning the carpets, and there was all this black stain on the floor of our walk-in closet. And I was like, what is that? And then I realized And I had literally spent so much time in there crying over different events that my mascara had stained the floor. And then I thought, well, this is a bit of a sanctuary, if you will, for grieving and or a birthing room, however you want to look at it. But I thought, why not just make it a thing? Why not just say and honor it? It's kind of a sacred space if you think about it. When I cry, do you know how cleansing? Well, I know you do. If this stood out to you, good cry, man, that does a body good. That's good medicine, and then I can actually move those emotions through me. It's pretty powerful.
Speaking of honor, what does it mean to live with honor after your loss?
Well, I think I would use a story there. So I have a client whose mom died far too young from ovarian cancer. And one of the things that her mother was talking about when she was on hospice was that she had a bucket list that she had been sort of following the year before, but it had been a pandemic, obviously, the pandemic. What else pandemic is there? But she didn't get to finish her bucket list, and she'd actually thrown it away because she got real frustrated. And her daughter went and combed the trash and found that. And then she put it on her refrigerator. And after her mom passed, she decided that one way to honor the life of her mother was to take she and her family and to go do with intention the things that were on her mom's bucket list. And that's one way to live with honor. And there's so many more, setting up a foundation, working like I do in service to other people who are facing the same difficulties. I write about the Bardens from Sandy Hook set up the nationwide life-altering programs that they have. Those are just some of the ways we can live with honor. And those are some of the bigger ones, but there are littler ones too, just every day remembering to make time for gratitude. Gratitude for the life that I have, the day that I'm in, the time I had with my person, in my marriage, with that friend. That's a small one.
What would you like readers to walk away understanding from your book and your work?
So that's a good question. The fancy term I always want to use, but my friends who are not therapists tell me to stop using it because I don't think it makes as much sense to people. But this book is really about post-traumatic growth and the possibility that the very things we wished would never happen to us are actually the doorway for the greatest changes, and not to avoid it, to actually go in. It's your next step.
Well, thank you so much. Readers, again, the book is When Grief is Good, Turning Your Greatest Loss into Your Biggest Lesson. Cindy, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. In addition to reading the book, where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Oh, yeah, thanks for asking. So my website is cindyfinch.com. It's pretty straightforward and simple. I'd love to see you guys there.
Great. Thanks.
You're welcome, Jean.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Author Hour podcast. You can get Cindy Finch's book, When Grief is Good, Turning Your Greatest Loss into Your Biggest Lesson, on Amazon. You can also find a transcript of this episode, as well as previous episodes, on our website, authorhour.co. Make sure to subscribe to the Author Hour podcast for more interviews and insights into life-changing books.